Okay. So, hello everybody, and welcome back to Big IDs on the Go. I'm very excited to have as our guest today, very veteran and successful and well-regarded CISO Jim Routh. So Jim has an exceptional background, and I'm thankful that he's willing to spare some of his time to join us as a guest today. So maybe Jim, just to start off, hello, how are you? Thank you for joining.
Dimitri, thank you. I'm glad to be here and looking forward to this podcast. Hope people can pick up one or two things to help them in their data protection initiatives going forward.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. So, I think it'd be great if you could tell the audience just a little bit about your particular background. I know, when there's a little bit of kind of Big ID history, and you and I first getting introduced just as we were kicking off the company, and obviously kind of, maybe 5 years ago or so. And, would love to have you share a little bit more about kind of where you've been and what you've done in the security world.
Sure. So I'm at the point of my career where I'm a lot better known for what I used to do versus what I do today. So I'm doing board and advisory work and advisor to Big ID, but I'm also a recently retired CISO, and I did that for 6 companies, most of big brand name kinds of companies, American Express, JP Morgan Chase, Aetna, CVS, Mass Mutual, KPMG, and others. So I have a lot of scar tissue from mistakes that I've made and kind of what I've learned from that and how I've applied that going forward from an enterprise protection standpoint. But I also have some experience with early stage and innovation in cybersecurity control design, which is kind of a sweet spot that I've focused on throughout my career. So I've been leading major data protection initiatives, fundamentally changing the attack surface for some of the largest enterprises, and I'm happy to share that information today.
Look, you're inviting a question. So, you've been at a few very well-known brands in around kind of both cyber and data security. Tell us a little bit more of what you've seen in terms of the evolution of data security, and I think it would also be interesting to get your take on, what are some of the emerging challenges because of cloud and maybe some of the regulations like GDPR.
Yeah, so it turns out I've spent most of my time in financial services. It's a regulated environment, and the regulations have been around for a couple of decades and evolved. And I've also spent about 6 years in healthcare, and I can tell you that when I moved from financial service to healthcare, my perspective in financial services is the diversity of threat actors that financial services addresses is far more significant than any other industry. And the volume of attacks within the diversity of tactics that are used is also substantially greater than other industries. So when I moved to healthcare, one of the things that intrigued me was that patient data was so pervasive and highly sensitive. So I was looking at data protection and really cybersecurity controls for healthcare based on the assumption that the intensity of the customer or patient information was so significant that it warranted some fundamentally different controls and approaches, and probably a very different threat landscape. And it turns out that the threat landscape for healthcare is actually not that different from financial services. There's a lot lower volume, but there's still diversity of threat actor tactics. And most of the monetization of data through cybersecurity criminal activity in healthcare is actually very similar to other industries. It's all about identity, and it's all about harvesting identity information, replicating identities, setting up new accounts and committing fraud. And even though healthcare data is so rich with sensitive data that's clinical, that has to do with patients, most of the cyber criminal activity is fairly traditional in stealing credentials and getting access to healthcare data, primarily to create new identities and commit fraud associated with that. So the criminal element in healthcare doesn't find it easy to monetize clinical data as easy as identity data. And so that was kind of a revelation for me. It took me many years to kind of figure it out because I was always looking for differences and nuances. And it turns out from a cybersecurity perspective that most of the criminal behavior in healthcare is very similar to other industries.
And so, you've seen this kind of this arc in around kind of data protection, both as you said in financial services,
Mm.
healthcare, and I think at the end you were kind of back in financial services.
Hmm.
Now, before you retired, there was a big kind of exogenous event that impacted all of us, which was COVID, and
Hmm.
that kind of shift to remote work. How did that affect things? Like, did that have any impact in terms of your thinking? And I realized it was kind of at the tail end, but tell us a little bit about that.
So what I can tell you is that data protection is, and really data management is part of the attack surface for an enterprise. And it turns out that some companies, some organizations have a far greater attack surface than other organizations. And these are companies or enterprises in similar industries. So I'll just pick on asset management as a subset of financial services. And it turns out that asset management businesses have grown accustomed to using a social security number as a unique identifier. And to give you a sense of what that means, the concentration of uses of social security number in business processes, in databases, in applications, in containers, in cloud instances is so much greater than other parts of financial services, banking as an example. So what happens is an enterprise will use a social security number, they'll obtain it from customer information, and then they'll replicate it 400 times across different systems and processes. And that creates this extensive attack surface for threat actors. And so what happened with COVID is the attack surface for every enterprise extended into the home and the home network. And so with that extension of the attack surface, it really made the data management problem that much more significant. So it didn't really that data management problem was always there and is always there. And asset management companies really across the board are trying to change their core processing and change their handling of data to try to shrink that
Yeah.
attack surface. That's all fine, well, and good. But the reality is, not only for employees that are now working from home, and therefore the extension of the attack surface is in their router and their router configuration for their home router, because 80% of people don't change the default password for the home router. So that's a vulnerability there.
Yeah.
And now there's much more intensive customer information that's flowing through that extended attack surface. So that's really what the challenge of COVID is as it relates to data protection. And there are not really established controls, because most financial service organizations didn't realize that they were having offshore resources handling customer data from anywhere other than development centers or customer service centers. And today, with India and the pandemic challenges that they have, everybody's working from home, which they
Yeah.
need to do to stay healthy. But that's now broadened or extended that attack surface significantly.
Yeah. So maybe, without going into specific companies, but, do you have advice from a cyber perspective, and in particular from the perspective of these kind of highly identifiable, social security, customer IDs, what should another organization think about to reduce that attack surface, to reduce the kind of footprint of this data that can proliferate and of course find its way into remote workers' homes?
Yeah. So one thing I'd like to advise everybody in the audience to do is avoid doing what I did probably close to 20 years ago. Thought I was doing the right thing, but not exactly. So what was happening is I looked at the NIST model for data protection. Now the NIST model 20 years ago was different than it is today, and it's quite good today. But 20 years ago it was 4 different classifications. So there was restricted, highly confidential, confidential, and public. And the challenge with that is that in every enterprise I ever worked in, the difference between highly confidential data and confidential was absolutely nothing. In other words, highly confidential added a word, but
Yeah.
the same controls were in place for highly confidential versus confidential. So other than that, adding the word, the controls were the same. And it turns out in the law of averages in a large enterprise, enterprises don't do well if you give them 4 things they have to remember. But if you give them 3 things they have to remember, they do a lot better. So what I was doing was changing the data classification model because they were 4 categories and the categories were meaningless. They weren't applied, they weren't consistent. So we got rid of highly confidential and just called it confidential. Now, that was a positive step. The step that wasn't positive is when I looked at the classification, I said, let's apply it to the enterprise's crown jewels as we look at the value of data for our enterprise. And it turns out that that filter, if you will, or perspective is absolutely the wrong filter to use. Yet many enterprises kind of look at their own data and say, oh, this type of data is the most valuable. So we're going to put our best controls on this type of data because that's the most valuable. We never want that released, right? It turns out if you look at your data classification and apply a filter of what's the most valuable information to the threat actor, you're going to come up with some different answers, and they're going to have significant implementation implications. Specifically, in a large enterprise, if 80% of the data in a large enterprise is customer data, and you holistically say that that 80% of data is going to be in a classification, let's call it confidential, what you're doing is you're essentially eliminating the possibility of putting your best controls on the most important data in the enterprise. Why? Because you have the lowest common denominator factor that you have to apply to the controls because it's so broad. It's across the entire enterprise, right? However, if you look at it from a threat actor's perspective and you say, well, threat actors want social security number. Why? It's the easiest data element to monetize. So that's what they want more than anything else. What else do they want? Well, they want credentials because it often leads to getting access to the social security number. So user ID and passwords are really, really sensitive from a threat actor perspective. And if you look at, if you've done pen tests or had third parties to access your environment or just read a lot, you can see it. And this is what threat actors do. They move laterally until they find credentials. They use credentials to escalate privilege, and then they go after the most important data to them, not the most important data to you. So for an enterprise, if you can take your most important data and get it into the 10 to 15% of all the data, then you can put your best cybersecurity controls on that data that's the most valuable to threat actors. And that's a scalable model. However, if you look at regulations and you say, we're going to make, the regulation's going to be this broad category of data, it tends to be so onersome across the entire enterprise that you can't put your best controls. So you're better off taking restricted data and saying social security numbers, user ID and password or credentials. And if you have credit card data, PCI data, then those are your 3 categories. Nothing else.
Yeah.
Those are the 3. That typically will limit it to somewhere between 10 and 15% of the data elements in the enterprise, and allow you a fighting chance to say, for restricted data, we're going to be putting in place more challenging controls that are a little bit more difficult to implement, but absolutely necessary and essential. Things like multi-factor authentication, data encryption at rest, as an example. Those are the things that we definitely want to apply in restricted category. Confidential, we still want to put significant controls in place, maybe multi-factor authentication in most cases, but essentially we want controls in place for that for regulatory purposes, but we don't want the best controls because they don't scale across the enterprise.
Sure.
So I learned this the hard way, because the first data classification I did, I said, crown jewels, right? This is the most important data. And it wasn't from the threat actor's perspective. So I'd encourage everyone, by the way, changing data classification is hard. I mean, it really has a ripple effect through the enterprise. You don't want to have to do this very often. So when you do, it is kind of important to get it right. And I think part of getting it right, look at it through the lens of a threat actor.
Yeah, I guess it's true. Not all crown jewels are made equal, and again, by limiting the scope of what you're trying to do, you could kind of and narrowing the scope, you could have better outcomes in terms of the data that you absolutely cannot lose or have compromised. So that's great advice for the audience. Maybe just as a kind of a final question before I let you go. You're kind of shifting in your career right now and working more with startups and kind of looking out over the horizon in terms of what's next. Would love to get your thoughts on what do you think are going to be the big challenges in data protection and cyber more broadly over the next 5 years, and what are the big opportunities for any of our audience members that are thinking of starting a company?
So I think there's a number of trends that we're going to see intensify, say, over the next 5 years. I'll start with, I believe, and this is not something that's widely discussed, but I believe data science, the discipline, the skill, the mastery of data science is foundational for a cybersecurity program. What does that mean? It means that for cybersecurity professionals, you have to teach them data science fundamentals so they have all of the tools necessary to design innovative cybersecurity controls going forward around data management, data protection, et cetera. But data science is fundamentally a game changer for cybersecurity. And I don't think that's going to change. I think it's only going to intensify. So there are ways of using data science to drive behavioral attributes and specify categories of behavior that you can apply controls in real time using a data streaming architecture that basically removes the need to send alerts to the SOC and instead takes specific actions for specific categories of behaviors all in real time without human intervention. And there's hundreds, potentially thousands of use cases of using basic fundamentals of data science in the design of controls that apply to identity access management. So that's number one. Number two, data governance is far more strategic and essential for the enterprise, being driven by a couple of things. One are the changes to privacy regulations that we're seeing globally and within the US, California as a specific example, but really across the state level and federal level. So data privacy regulation is going through a change process, and that change means enterprises have to stay on top of those changes, anticipate some of those changes, and build that into their core data protection and data management practices. And data governance as a discipline is now emerging as a key and strategic discipline for the enterprise, and that's going to continue to grow. I don't think it's going to change. I also think that the shift to cloud computing has data governance implications that enterprises have to manage differently going forward. So I think we'll see that as a trend. And then the third is that we, the enterprise, have to prove that we're handling customer data in the best interests of the customer. And in some cases, that may be giving the customer the option of deleting their data. And in other cases, it may be explicitly explaining how the data is being used. But that responsibility for any enterprise that's in a consumer oriented business, there's an obligation and responsibility across the entire enterprise, all of the business processes, the core systems, how the data is stored and managed. All of that is becoming more accountable for the digital consumer. And Europe and the EU have really manifested regulations from the consumer perspective for the last couple of decades. So that's not necessarily new, but it is certainly new to the United States in that most of the privacy laws in the United States have been focused on implementation by industry segment and enforcement through different regulatory bodies, and not necessarily focused on the end consumer. But I think what we're seeing is the consumer's voice is being recognized more, and enterprises have to essentially prove to the consumer that they're handling customer data in the best interests of the consumer. And I think that's going to also grow over the next several years.
Yeah, look, I would certainly echo that, and I think there's an old adage that customers buy from companies they trust, and I think the
Mm.
more transparency and trust companies provide to the data that customers deposit with them, the more loyal those customers become. So very good point. So Jim, I want to thank you again for joining us on this episode of Big Ideas on the Go. I think this has been great. I think you made a significant contribution to the area of security, and I kind of wish you nothing but the best in the next phase of your career as you start working with startups on that next phase of where security and cyber and that kind of convergence with data governance and convergence with data science goes. So thank you again. So everybody, I'll just remind you to please subscribe to Big Ideas on the Go, wherever you listen to your podcasts, on Apple or elsewhere. And again, Jim Routh, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Dimitri.
Okay, take care. Bye.